welcome to the Helping Families Be Happy podcast, where we explore the often messy world of family love and relationships. I'm your host for this podcast, Christopher Robbins, the co-founder of Familius Publishing, husband, father of 9, author and fly fisherman, based in the beautiful Central Valley of California. We hope to bring you nourishing, real-life information about love, family, relationships, and life. And today, we are thrilled to introduce our guest, Barry Relaford. Now, Barry has worked with leaders and teams from over 140 countries. He is the founder of The Strength of 10, a consulting firm focused on inspiring individuals and organizations to perform purposeful and sustainable work. His extensive experience in the learning and development industry strengthened several industry leaders, and he was a co-founder and master facilitator at Franklin Covey's Speed of Trust practice, and actually co-authored the business parable, A Slice of Trust. Additionally, Barry is a Gallup certified strengths coach. His favorite work roles now focus on developing the next generation of emerging leaders. He's the executive leadership coach at the Sorensen Center for Moral and Ethical Leadership, as well as a strategic advisor to the Waterford Project and Comora Academy in the Czech Republic. Barry and his wife, Laura Lee, live in the shadows of the Rocky Mountains with her family. Barry's interests outside of work include family activities, music, reading, inspirational writing, and people development, of course. Well, today we're exploring leadership and trust, particularly within our family. This podcast aligns with the Familius habits learned together and loved together. And you can learn more about the Familius 10 Habits of Happy Families by going to the Habit Hub blog on familius.com. For the video of this podcast, please go to the Familius YouTube channel. And as always, you can find a significant and wonderful library of available books at familius.com to help your family be happy. Now, Barry, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here, Christopher. Thank you for the opportunity.
I think we've known each other for close to 20 years now. Has it been that long?
It just feels like it. No, it's been at least 13, 14, something like that. And yeah, it could be 20. Yes.
Close to 20. So let's talk about leadership. You've had some amazing experiences to get to know, to interview, talk with, and actually consult with perhaps some of the industry's greatest leaders. So in your experience, what defines, or what does it mean to even be a leader?
Well, and this isn't intended to be cute, but arguably you go onto social media, you get followers, you become a leader. But I think that's now been trumped by the word influencer. It used to be a word that meant something different. But fundamentally, I think leadership is about positive influence. So certainly in families, parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, even siblings we're all leaders. At a minimum, we need to lead our own lives, but how do we help those around us? How do we positively influence ourselves and each other? And I've learned that watching these so-called captains of industries and other types of organizations. But I think that's if I kind of distill leadership to its essence, it's around positive influence, inviting people to be who they really are.
Perhaps you can take a second and maybe consider some of these captains of industry or leaders that you've read about, historical leaders. Help us gain an understanding of who you have admired and what you've learned about those leaders.
Well, again, certainly speaking to the Familius audience, I think about what I learned from my parents. My dad died when I was 7. I did not know him well. But one of the things I do know about my dad is he loved his children. And there was a big loss in my life to lose my dad. He wasn't dad, he was daddy and still. And so I was raised by a single mom. And she, I think as a teenager, you go through what is a typical, at least in Western society, kind of independence or counter-dependence stage. And it's really, especially as an adult and a parent myself, that I've grown to appreciate my mother so much more. And I have a half brother who had shared with me once, "Oh, you're so much like your mother." And at the time, I bristled a bit at it. Today, I really embrace that. And so some of the greatest leaders, I think, and some of the most important leaders are our parents, or as a parent, I recognize my most important work is not going to be what I do in a company or with a military organization or a school. It's going to be in with our children and our grandchildren. And so some of the leaders I admire the most are actually people within families. And I didn't know my grandparents very well. Um, my dad's parents were gone by the time I was born, and I remember the only grandparent I got to know a bit was a grandmother who passed away by the time I was 9. So again, this family legacy, I think is a really important one. It's one Laura Lee and I we take seriously. I can do better in, as so. But other people, as I looked at, some of the people I admire most as leaders are not always very well known. It's people who are in a sense, answering a call. I believe that leadership is a calling, and a calling to some people may be a position. But the word in English comes from a Latin root vocare, which is voice or to call. And I really think about when we talk about work together, it's a vocation or a calling. And I think the call to lead and to positively influence people. So I really admire some people who just are your listeners. Well, probably a lot of them may not know about, but leaders in my church that I'm reading a biography now of a educator and leader in our church, David O. McKay, who lived not far from where you and I met. I think you were living in Huntsville, and he's a leader that as I study his life and I've learned about him, didn't know him personally, but very powerful person, and not in the way that people would think about power often, but the power to influence and to love and to uplift. So I could go on and on about leaders for 20 minutes, but there are a lot of people I admire. I admire my wife a lot. We only have 6 children, Christopher. We're nowhere near you guys, but um, who they are as adults now, they're all adults, has Laura Lee, I was very blessed or chose well to be able to marry a really great person who's raised 6 great kids.
Well,
So
we always encourage the men in our lives to marry up, and
mhm.
we seem to always do that, right?
It's not that hard actually. So
No. So that's wonderful. I'm thrilled to hear that you thought of your mother as perhaps the most important leader. I think as we get older, we start to appreciate our parents far more than we do when we're younger and teenagers. In fact, our parents become smarter and smarter the older that we get. But you mentioned a couple of things, a couple of principles toward the end of what you were saying. In your experience, have you identified some core characteristics of leaders that you think we should aspire to develop?
yes. So there's a quote by George MacDonald that if listeners here have heard of C.S. Lewis, George MacDonald in many ways, C.S. Lewis would consider his, I don't know, mentor in a lot of ways. But he said this quote that really struck me. It's one we quote in the book, The Speed of Trust, but it is a greater compliment to be trusted than to be loved. And we've probably all been in relationships where you loved someone, but you couldn't trust them. That is heartbreaking, especially when someone you're bound to through marriage or blood. And yeah, and there are people I trust that I don't love a lot. I mean, it's not like, oh, but I respect them. They say to do something, I'll do it. Or if I entrust them to do something, I have great confidence they'll do it. So trust and love are, we're all often talking about likability and trust. There's people I like, they're fun. I might want to do something social, but I wouldn't trust them with something important, not with a child, not with money, not with my reputation. And yet there's people I would trust those things with. I don't, their style is different than mine. I may not want to do something fun with them, but and so for me, one of the wisdom aspects of that is to say, there are people that I need to watch myself say, just because I like someone doesn't mean I should trust them. Be careful there, Barry. But typically people I trust, I like, or even grow to love. And that applies in the family. We had one of our sons who kind of got off the values that we believe as a family, really had an addiction he was really struggling with. And there came to a point, and he was an adult, he wanted to live back at home. And I just said, hey, look, you've got to live by these standards that we have as a family. And he wasn't willing to live by those. And so it's like, as much as I care about you and love you, I cannot fully trust you. And that's a hard message, a hard place to be in. And yet, one of the things I consciously worked at with him was to continue to trust as much as I could that was wise. And he couldn't trust himself fundamentally. This addiction had taken such control in his life that he wasn't who he really is. And so that thankfully, blessedly, he's outgrown that. A lot of it's through spiritual and really, again, talking about families, his now wife has made a huge difference. But these are hard things. And again, I want to have empathy for listeners here who may say, oh, you guys have these big families and I'm sure everything's great. And it's like, I think it increases our chances sometimes of heartbreak. Uh,
Yeah,
so
as I said to people, if you have 9 kids, every day there's something.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
so okay, thank you for sharing that. That sounds hard, and I imagine all families who are listening can empathize that one way or another they've had a challenge and a hardship, a trial to go through. So sometimes trust is broken.
Hmm.
So how can we, as a family, in a company, in a relationship, how do we begin rebuilding that trust when perhaps we're disappointed?
Yeah, and I mean, at a minimum, Christopher, we disappoint ourselves and others, and sometimes and it can go all the way to betrayal and abuse. I mean, there bad things happen. I mean, there's child abuse usually is by, and a lot of other sexual abuse happens with people know. So I don't want to minimize any of those experiences people have endured. Um, I'm reminded of a story, actually, Dr. Covey. So I call Stephen R. Covey, the author of the Seven Habits, I call him Dr. Covey to distinguish him from Stephen M. R. Covey, his son, that I work closely with. But Dr. Covey told this story once. I think it's printed in the Seven Habits book. He was teaching a workshop and he said it was such a beautiful day. We went outside, we're at a beach, and there's these big rocks. We're sitting on these rocks, we're talking about these great principles. And he says, of course, as a good facilitator, he's watching your teacher, he's watching his group. And so there's this one guy who's just not with them. I mean, he's sitting there, but it's like you can tell he's off somewhere else. So he said, we had a break, and he says, I walked up to this person and said, is everything all right? And the guy said, "Oh, it's fine. It's my wife." And Stephen continues to listen, and he says, "Yeah, it's what's going to happen today." And this is before the days of cell phones, I think. But he said, I'm going to get a call tonight in my room, and it's going to be something like this: "What'd you do today? Who'd you sit next to? What'd you do for lunch? What are you doing for dinner?" Dr. Covey's listening, and the person continues, I guess I shouldn't be surprised since I met my current wife when I was at a workshop like this, married to someone else. And Dr. Covey said, my friend, you can't talk your way out of a problem you behave yourself into. In our work with the speed of trust, what we found is you cannot talk your way out of a problem you behaved yourself into, but you can behave your way out. And that to me is one of the biggest things about restoring trust, even if it's just a drop, a disappointment all the way down to, wow, it's very severe, is that it is possible. Now, it's not always wise. If somebody's in an abusive situation, you need to get out. If you've got children, get them out of that. That's a different category. And the thing to do is create separation. And whoever's, hopefully you're not the one causing the abuse, that the abuser can get help and be able to. And over time, you have to decide, do you want to have a relationship? And if so, what does that look like? But in many of our just normal living with each other, where we're struggling through life, we're trying to figure stuff out, it's being able to recognize that we can change. It is possible. There is hope. And that to me is what I get from Dr. Covey's story. And I have seen I've talked with so many people, seen it myself, where things that I've wrestled with or are difficult, that over time I'm changing, I'm getting better, I'm improving, and I'm grateful for that. And again, a lot of these most important, I don't know, most important laboratory oftentimes is our homes, our social systems where we struggle, learn, grow together. We make mistakes. We learn forgiveness. We learn flexibility, adaptability. We also learn the importance of boundaries and having standards, that things we will stand for and things we won't. But in this microcosm, this crucible of home, I think a lot of beautiful things happen there.
So that's a powerful story, that you can't talk your way out of a problem that you behaved your way into. Um, and yet there is hope. We can behave our way out of the challenges that we create. And that aligns with, I would say, additional Familius habits. Talk together, heal together, give together. Give includes forgiveness.
Yes.
So you brought all of those to the table. Thank you. Well, you talked about a little bit about leadership and identified leaders in your own life, and you've talked a little bit more about trust. Now, can you bring those two together somehow and help us say, okay, we want to be better leaders. We want to lead ourselves better. We want to lead our families better. We want to lead whatever organization we're involved in better. So help us put trust and leadership
Sure.
together in some
Absolutely.
way.
Oh, great. Thank you. Great summary so far, Christopher, and a great opportunity for connection is that one of the things I'm thinking a lot of family stories given the context of Familius, but as I talk with our children, particularly when they're getting to the age where they were starting to drive or their friends are starting to drive their age, was saying like, hey, look, if you're in a situation that you're not comfortable, call us. We'll come get you. I don't care where you are, when you are, we'll come get you. You don't have to, because in a sense, when we're being led by someone, we're kind of getting in their car. And as we both know, I don't know if you were like as a teenage driver. I wasn't that great. I had a few wrecks and, learning stuff. You're much more confident than sometimes wrong, but never in doubt. But having that, recognizing that trust is a choice, just like leading is a choice. And we choose to follow people. And that's where we look at social media and other things going on and saying, be wise, be smart about who you choose to follow and who you trust. And another word for trust that I speak French, and the word for trust in French is la confiance. And the word in French for confidence is la confiance. It's the same word. Same thing in Spanish, same thing in Portuguese, same thing in Arabic. I'm trying to think of other languages as I've talked with people. Excuse me. But so really, where do you put your confidence or reliability? Who do you rely on? So if you're going to lead, recognize that people will not follow you. You can coerce them, you can force them, you can put enough negative consequences in place, they'll do what you want them to do. But you are also creating guerrilla fighters and you're creating resistance. And the true motive, trusting people, we thrive in high trust relationships as humans. In fact, you have to kind of teach kids, you can finish this phrase for me, stranger.
Danger.
Yeah. Why do we have to teach kids that?
Why do we have to teach kids that? Because we don't trust.
Well, it's because kids are too trusting, right? And we as adults, and sometimes you cannot trust all adults. There are enough things we see and a lot of troubled people in the world that, children, we want to watch out for all children, not just the ones that are in our households. But kids are often too trusting in the society in which we live. And yet we are designed as humans, I believe, to be in high trust relationships. We are social beings. We are at our best. We are our truest when we are in loving and trusting relationship with one another. And so if we're going to, in a sense, submit our will or follow the direction of someone, we want to make sure that's someone that we can trust. And I think what encourages me, Christopher, I work a lot with emerging leaders. There's a lot of scary, discouraging, troubling things in this world. And I think there's great hope. The time I spend with great leaders and around the world, these great leaders are not all captains of industry, as I've said. Some of them are in their teenage years, they're in their early 20s. And we have a great world ahead. We can kind of hold ourselves together because of who they are and what they'll bring about. And I think some of the problems we face today, they are going to help us as civilization become more civilized. And I'm hoping what we're going through is a rough patch, but I actually have a lot of hope about the future. And so again, for me, leadership and trust are very intertwined. Don't follow someone you don't trust even if you absolutely have to, look for other options as quick as you can. But be somebody that can be trusted. And what you'll find is you'll be influential with the people that matter. And again, within families, you've got to have trust. And parents need to lead. That's one of the big problems we have today is that parents are not leading their families in ways that children really need people they can trust and look up to and grow into what it is to be a healthy person.
Well, that is great advice. And we appreciate that you would take time out of your busy schedule, helping emerging leaders become the leaders that they hope and the world needs. And it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Now, where can our guests find you online, Barry?
I am not So I am on Facebook, but and mostly that's friends and stuff, but I'm glad to connect with people. LinkedIn is my more professional thing. I don't have a website. I do have a book, A Slice of Trust, but I think it might even be out of print. Christopher, you helped me publish that. Thank you for the extension of trust in that. I'm working on another book right now, but I don't have, it's not far enough along to say, oh, here's where it's going to be published and all that. So LinkedIn is probably the best way to reach out to me. But again, if they reach out to you, Christopher, you can get a hold of me. You can.
Well, thank you again. And as we conclude today's podcast, I'd like to thank Familius for its support in bringing the podcast to your ears and your heart. And of course, we'd be thrilled if you subscribed to the podcast and left a review. And when you're ready for that next amazing book adventure, we'd be honored if you chose a book from Familius. One step at a time, trusting wisely, and being a good leader, we can make the world a happier place.